Good evening. Tonight we're going to do a Q&A. I received an email with the subject line, Song of Songs. And the email said, hey Clint, I need a little help here, please. What is the biblical purpose of the Song of Songs in the Bible? They seem to be beautiful verses about love and passion, but I just can't figure out why these verses are in here. Solomon certainly didn't seem to love any one woman, and that doesn't lend credibility to the verses about this love of a singular woman. I have read the introduction in study Bibles, but it doesn't answer my question. Is there an answer, or is it just as simple as showing the beauty of love between man and a woman? That doesn't seem quite right, because the rest of the Bible is packed with powerful lessons in history and obedience to God. Clearly the question centers around the unique nature of this book in the Old Testament. How many of you have read the Song of Songs lately? That was more than I expected, which was what, one? It's not a popular book in the sense that you don't hear lessons from it. And I rarely have taught it or preached from it, other than to quote a few different verses for various reasons. But I'll try to address the question and help us to have a better understanding of the nature of the book, as well as why God would seem to want to include something like this in the Bible. So I have quite a bit of notes written out, and that will save me hopefully from stumbling over my words, because it can be a little bit of a sensitive subject if we're talking about human sexuality, and I have to preach about it from the pulpit. And so some of this will be read, but it's from notes that if you're interested in, I could email you or give you a copy of these. The Song of Songs is a poem that celebrates the joys of marital love. Now the title is in chapter 1 and verse 1 that says, the Song of Songs, Solomon's. That's how the English translation, if you just took the words in Hebrew and you tried to put an English word for those, a word for word translation would say that. The Song of Songs, Solomon's. And this, of course, implies that it's a poetic work that's either for Solomon, by Solomon, or perhaps about Solomon. It doesn't mean Solomon wrote it. Not inherently, it doesn't mean that. And the question had to do with how could Solomon, who was a polygamist, write a book that seemed to be about monogamy, right? And it doesn't seem to match Solomon's own lifestyle and the sins that he fell into in his life with so many wives and concubines. But it's important to understand that the title doesn't mean that Solomon wrote it. I tend to believe he did not write it as if he is the author, but that the title can mean that it comes from the School of Solomon, or that it is for the School of Solomon, which would be the Hebrew wisdom literature, such as Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. These are the kinds of literature that would be considered Solomon's, in that he is the head of the school of wisdom in Israel. Just like David, his father was the head of psalmody. He was the sweet psalmist of Israel. Well, Solomon was the wise ruler of Israel. And so perhaps that's all it means when it says the Song of Songs, which belongs to the school of Solomon, or belongs to his collection of wisdom, because it is poetic wisdom literature. It doesn't really matter one way or the other. We do know that it is God's Word. Jesus accepted the Hebrew canon of the Old Testament, which included the Song of Solomon, and so we accept it as well. And so it can mean that it was written in some way about him, and there is a school of interpretation that believes that Solomon is referenced. I mean, he is referenced clearly in a few different verses, but not as a hero, but ultimately the interpretive school says that he's actually the villain, meaning that they believe that Solomon was trying to steal the love of a girl who was in love with a lowly shepherd boy. and was betrothed, and that Solomon was trying to steal this girl and bring him into his harem, but the girl refused because she was in love with one lowly boy. Chapter 8 and verse 12 was interpreted to mean that Solomon, you could have thousands, but you can't have me. My own vineyard is before me. You, O Solomon, may have 1,000, and those who tend its fruit 200. The point is that I am keeping myself pure for my beloved. And Solomon, you can't have me. So maybe that is the way this works. And perhaps it's through that Solomon learned the beauty of monogamy. But it was too late for him. Right? And so perhaps that's the lesson. I keep saying perhaps and maybe because we're not sure. And when it comes to this type of Hebrew literature, certainty is a pretty difficult thing to come by often in some of these details. So perhaps that is an accurate way of understanding this. It's similar to a Shenandoah song, The Moon Over Georgia. You remember, anybody know that song? She took the moon over Georgia. It's about this rich, wealthy man who lived in Atlanta who was trying to get the girl, and he could offer her everything. He could offer her all the wealth. The whole state of Georgia could be hers, but she chose the moon over Georgia because she was in love with a pauper. She was in love with a poor man who all he could offer her was the moon at night under his lowly, or over his lowly dwelling. And she chose the moon over all of Georgia. So maybe that's what is behind this, where there is a girl who is in love with a lowly shepherd boy, and she has committed herself to him, and he has committed himself to her, and they are awaiting and anticipating the consummation of their marriage. But one thing's for sure, the song is unique among biblical literature because of its many references to married love. It is the song of all songs. That's what the title means, Song of Songs. We often say Song of Solomon. That's not what it's titled. It's called the Song of Songs. It's like the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, right? The Song of all songs. And it's touching on one of the most deep relationships that God has ever created. It is very sexually suggestive in its imagery, but that has caused many Bible students to dismiss the primary message as being just simply an allegory that depicts God's love for his people, or maybe Christ's love for the church. So if you're a Jew, an Old Testament scholar, you would say it's God's love for Israel. If you're a Christian, primarily in medieval Christianity, your primary method of interpretation would be that it's an allegory for Christ's love for his church. We even have a song that comes from that idea, the lily of the valley. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. That's from chapter 2 and verse 1 of this book, and it's applied to Jesus. Jesus, Rose of Sharon. That's another one, right? But of course, in the story of the Song of Solomon, it's not talking about the Messiah. It's not talking about Jesus. It's talking about the Shulamite woman, and that she is beautiful to behold. And so many people they find it difficult to reconcile how a book about physical love could have found its way into the Bible without having some kind of allegorical or secondary meaning that's more appropriate in their way of thinking. And of course, the question that's asked kind of reflects that thinking. But of course, this idea is based on an unscriptural idea about God-given sex. Christianity, historically, has had a problem of unbiblical thinking about human sexuality. It was predicted in the New Testament, you remember, that there will be a great departure, there will be a great apostasy, and among that will be the forbidding of marriage. Why? Because of asceticism that entered into the church and the idea that sex is dirty. And yet it was created by God as a beautiful thing in the confines and in the context of God's creation, in the marriage relationship. And so a more balanced view, I think, would be to understand that the Bible is really less than complete without the Song of Solomon in it. It's a holy treatment of one of the most foundational and profound human relationships possible. And wouldn't we expect not only the creator, but also the regulator of this relationship to have an eternal word about it? And that's what the Song of Songs is, I believe. What is more intimate than the one flesh relationship of the marriage covenant? It's the most physically intimate that people can get. That's why the perversion of it is such an abomination to God. That's why fornication, pornography, lust is a perversion of the most sacred physical relationship that God ever created. And it's appalling to God when it is perverted. That's why you have so many warnings against it and how detrimental it is to a person's mind, body, and soul. But we have in the Song of Songs a beautiful treatment of it in its proper context, that God says, I want people who are in this covenant to enjoy the blessing that I've given them of marital love. Well, one thing that seems to be certain is that its primary interpretation, therefore, should center on the joys and the triumph of pure and monogamous marital relationships, marital love, between a male virgin and a female virgin. That's the ideal. That's what marriage is for. Isn't it? The woman saves herself for marriage. The man keeps himself pure and protects the woman until the marriage, through the betrothal period and for the consummation. That's God's design, and that's when it can be enjoyed in its fullest and in its purity. And of course, that's why the question reflects that surely this can't be Solomon. He was not the epitome of monogamy. But this book treats the joys of marital love and does so in a way that can be described as certainly as sensual, but never as vulgar, never as obscene. But the primary challenge of approaching the Song of Solomon, once we accept this truth that it's about the marriage relationship, it's about sexuality. Now the problem is how to understand all the figures of speech that are in there, because we're talking about ancient Hebrew poetry. And so there's going to be idioms that are known only to that culture that we struggle with, and we have a hard time understanding what all the references are to. They come from many different areas of life, such as gardening, shepherding, hunting, cooking, cosmetics, jewelry, makeup, perfumery. I made that word up. But there's a whole lot about fragrances and how things smell. So you can see that it's tapping into your senses more than anything else, more than any other place in the Bible. Because it's trying to get that across, that God created your senses physically and created your bodies physically to be enjoyed in the proper context. And that's what this is all about. Marital bliss is depicted, therefore, in rather suggestive references. And what the book is doing, it's laid out as a dialogue between the bride, and she is called the Shulamite. And she's in dialogue with her beloved. She calls him her beloved. And that's the male counterpart. And it depicts the emotion, anticipation, and finally the ecstasy of marital love. But it does it in a masterful way, in figures of speech that incorporate what we sometimes refer to as double entendre, where we refer to something everyday or average, but it has a meaning that relates to the marriage relationship. Chapter 1 and verse 6, for example, she says, "Do not look upon me because I'm dark. The sun has tanned me or darkened me." Now again, we don't understand that. We think, well, I want to be tan, right? But that was not seemly in this culture. It's better to be pale of skin, your skin to be ivory as best as possible. If you were dark, that was not attractive in that culture. And she says, "Don't look at me. I've been out. I've been forced to be outside. My mother's sons were angry with me, so they made me to keep the vineyard. So I've been out in the sun all day long, and I'm not as attractive to you as I wish I was." But then look at the next phrase. It says, "But my own vineyard I have not kept." That's a double entendre. She's not meaning my own vineyard literally. She's meaning my own body. I haven't been able to maintain my body as I want to. So this is the kind of thing you read throughout. And we don't always understand exactly what's being referred to, but for the most part, the message is pretty obvious. It's a lot of sensuality here. But again, it's holy. It's from God, and it must be enjoyed in the proper context, or it is unholy and an abomination. And so let's look at a few of these as best we can. For instance, in chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, the enjoyment of one with his or her mate is like a gazelle feeding among the lilies. Chapter 2 and verse 16, "My beloved is mine, and I am his. He feeds his flock among the lilies." Well, that's a way of saying he is enjoying her body. It's the way God intended the marriage relationship. But it's stated in terms that are suggestive, and yet there's purity to it, and beauty, and wholesomeness, because that's really what's going on in the relationship as God intended it. In verse 17, she says, "Until the day breaks and the shadows flee away, turn, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or young stag upon the mountains." In other words, we have all night. So you can see how suggestive this is. But, again, that's the point of the book. It's a blessing from God, and it should be treated as such. Letter B, the beloved's own physical description. I'm not saying letter B, that's what I'm reading on my notes here. I'm trying to stick to my notes here and getting sweaty a little bit up here. The beloved's own physical description of his betrothed is seen in chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. Let's read through a little bit of this. "Behold, you are fair, my love. Behold, you are fair." We would say, you're beautiful. You are beautiful. You have dove's eyes behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats going down from Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of shorn sheep which have come up from the washing, and every one of them bears twins. They're healthy, they're robust. None of them is barren. Your lips are like a strand of scarlet. Your mouth is lovely. Your temples behind your veil, that's probably her cheeks, according to many students. They're like a piece of pomegranate. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built for an armory, on which hang 1,000 bucklers, all shields of the mighty men. And we're going to stop there, obviously. But you're seeing where we're going with that, right? We're being treated to God's presentation of the blessings of marriage. And it's something to give him glory for and something to praise him for, because it's a beautiful design. He will enjoy her until daybreak, verse 6. "Until the day breaks and the shadows flee away, I will go my way to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense." And yet she keeps herself pure. This is all in anticipation, by the way. You haven't even reached the consummation yet. This is in anticipation. It's drawing near. We're betrothed. We're committed to one another. And by the way, the betrothal or betrothal, however you pronounce that, that period in this culture is not the same thing as our engagement. We want to think it's the same thing. Our engagement is not a legally binding contract. You can break off an engagement and there be no legal ramifications. A betrothal period is a legal commitment. You enter into the covenant when you become betrothed. Primarily when the man's parents bring the bride price to the parents of the bride and they make that exchange and you enter into this legal covenant. And you can't get out of it without divorce, without legal proceedings of divorce. And you risk, of course, getting in a circumstance where you are not eligible for marriage again. Do you remember when Joseph thought that Mary was unfaithful? He was minded to put her away secretly. Remember that? He knew he didn't get her pregnant. And so who else could it have been? Had to have been somebody else. So he thought she was unfaithful. Well, they hadn't even consummated the marriage. They were still in the betrothal period, but he had to go through the legal proceedings if he was going to divorce her. And he would be putting her away for the cause of fornication. She would not be able to marry again. That's how profound the marriage relationship is and how serious God is about preserving it and upholding it in its sanctity. But our engagement is not like that. We can break off an engagement without breaking a covenant. But that's what this is. This is anticipation. They're anticipating it. The marriage will come shortly, but she is keeping herself pure. Chapter 4 and verse 12, a garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. Your plants are an orchard of pomegranates with pleasant fruits, fragrant henna with spikenard, and saffron. Goes through all of this, again, the fragrances and the senses being affected. But she is keeping herself pure. She's closed up right now. She's not misusing her body. And she invites only him to enjoy her delights, for whom she has saved herself exclusively. That's verse 16. Awake, O north wind, and come, O south, blow upon my garden, that its spices may flow out, that let my beloved come to his garden and eat its pleasant fruits. So again, this is the height of the anticipation before the ceremony and the consummation. It's probably as far as we need to go, isn't it? What are some practical considerations? This is how the book unfolds. It's following the betrothal into the consummation, and the beauty of the marital relationship is exalted. But we want to make the points here in conclusion that erotic love between a husband and a wife is among God's choicest gifts. It should be celebrated as such. It's not shameful. It's not a thing to be degraded by perverting it and distorting it, as we've mentioned. But that the two people are to keep themselves pure so that God can bless the covenant of marriage in the greatest way possible. And the bond will be strong and unbreakable. An affectionate bond between husband and wife is not something shameful and shouldn't be hidden from public view. Chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. What is a banner over me? That's another, don't we sing something like that? His banner over me was love. You don't sing it? We used to. But anyway, it's about showing the world, I love this woman. She is the center of my affection. His banner over me was love. It's good for a husband and wife to display a healthy marriage to the world, especially in a culture that we live in today that disparages biblical marriage. Number 2, it is guarded. It should be guarded and kept in check. Erotic love, that is, should be guarded and kept in check. until it is within the bonds of matrimony. You have a recurring phrase in the book that goes something like this: do not awaken love until it pleases. Chapter 2, verse 7. Do not stir up nor awaken love until it pleases, at the end of that verse. Chapter 3, verse 5. Chapter 8, verse 4. The idea there is that it's a very strong drive that God created in us. That's why it can be such a blessing when exercised correctly, but it can also be a terrible temptation if you get yourself in that direction and in that context and you're not in a position to fulfill it. It's unwise. It's foolhardy. And so this is reiterated over and over in the book. And the point of the book is that the only place that it is acceptable is in an exclusive and monogamous marriage. Chapter 2 and verse 16. I think we just read that one already. My beloved is mine and I am his. That's found several times in the book. But you see the exclusivity. One man and one woman. And they belong to each other, and that's it. Erotic love in a marriage relationship is a fire and a zeal that is planted by God himself. Chapter 8 and verse 6 says, set me as a seal upon your heart, a seal upon your arm, because love, that would be married love, is as strong as death. Jealousy is as cruel as the grave. Its flames are flames of fire. It is a most vehement flame, my translation says. The literal wording there is, it is the flame of Yah. And that's, Yah was a shortened term of Yahweh, a shortened word for Yahweh. He's the covenant God of Israel. He's the God of heaven. And it's as if to say God is the one who plants a husband's zeal for his wife. And you don't tamper with his wife, because she belongs to him and he is going to protect her and he's not going to take any bribes. Isn't that strong? In fact, I have a cross-reference of Proverbs 6 where this is attempted by somebody who has tampered with another man's wife. In Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 32, we read, whoever commits adultery with a woman lacks sense. He who does so destroys his own life. Wounds and dishonor he will get. His reproach will not be wiped away. Because, why? Because jealousy is a husband's fury. He will not spare in the day of vengeance. He will not accept a recompense. He will not be appeased, though you offer many gifts. You cannot tamper with a man's wife and then expect to bribe the husband to leave you alone. And it's because jealousy is a flame of Yahweh. And it's proper. Husband has every right to exact vengeance on somebody who tampers with his wife. That's what the Bible is saying here. Don't think you can bribe him with $1,000. He'll take your $1,000 and he'll still bash your head in. And again, rightly so. And so it cannot be bought nor manipulated, because it is a fire that is planted by God himself. By the way, God is a jealous God. The same jealousy that a husband has for his wife, if somebody tries to attack the wife, that's what God says he has for you. And he will visit that zeal upon the enemies of Christianity ultimately. So in conclusion, the Song of Songs reminds us that we should recognize and praise God for his amazing design of the one flesh covenant of marriage. And it's just important to stress this. Physical attraction and erotic love is one of the blessings, a great blessing of marriage, but it is not the basis of marriage. In other words, If a marriage struggles such that there's the physical attraction wanes, the erotic love is perhaps absent, that doesn't mean that the marriage is dissolved or that the marriage can be set aside, because a marriage is primarily a covenant that you enter into. It's a binding contract between a man and a woman that cannot be set aside. God hates divorce. And while there is forgiveness, of course, for anyone who sins, there are still repercussions. And that's why we need to uphold the sanctity of marriage. And in our culture today, the church is alarmed at the speed at which unscriptural ideas about what constitutes marriage is so prevalent in our culture. You know, a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. But we began to sacrifice marriage in the church when we began to allow divorces to take place and not speak out against divorce, even in what we might call a loveless marriage. What we probably mean is a marriage that is without the physical attraction or erotic love that should be there but may not be. We need to uphold the sanctity of marriage because it is God's design, and God, of course, regulates it. In conclusion, I will simply read this quote from one of the commentaries, one of the study resources that I had, and then the lesson is yours. The Song of Songs is ultimately a song that is in praise of married love with dramatic development from desire through to fulfillment. Its teaching on the sanctity and joy of ideal love and its imperatives of chastity and lifelong faithfulness contribute significantly to the completeness of Scripture. So that kind of goes to the question that was asked, why is this in the Bible? Because it makes the Bible complete. It is the relationship that God has created and now regulates, and it is one of the strongest and deepest relationships that is possible between two people, and God speaks directly to it in the Song of Songs. And while it's true that probably the Song of Songs is more at place in the home than it is in the pulpit, it's nonetheless something that we want to remind ourselves of as God's people, and to thank God for the blessings that He has given us. And now, if you're interested in studying the Song of Songs, good luck in untangling some of those idioms from ancient Hebrew poetry, but it is a blessing, and it keeps you focused on the holiness of God, which should be reflected in the holiness of your own marriage. Thank you all so much for your attention this evening. We're going to sing a song of invitation at this time. If anyone needs to respond publicly, you can do that now. Let's stand and sing.